Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's learning session, How the BioCarbon Fund Will Pilot Results-Based Payments for Landscapes, organized by WWF Forest and Climate. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. My name is Emmeline Gasparini, and I am a Program Associate with the Forest and Climate team. Our presenter today is Marco van der Linden from the World Bank. Next slide, please. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few logistics and some frequently asked questions. And for those of you who have participated in past sessions, this will sound familiar, but yes, today's presentation is being recorded, and you can find the recording within a few days on our YouTube channel. To get to the recording, simply go to youtube.com and search for WWF Forest and Climate. There are two audio options. You can listen through your computer or dial in through the phone number that was provided in your registration email. And it's important to note that if you experience audio difficulties while listening through your computer, these are sometimes caused by having too many browser windows or programs open at once. So feel free to close some of them, which usually solves the issue, or you're always welcome to join by phone. And if you continue to have technical difficulties, please send me a message via the chat or questions function, and I'll try to get you sorted out as quickly as possible. And questions are absolutely welcome. You can send your questions anytime during the webinar using the toolbar on your screen. And we'll answer as many as possible during our allotted time. And if we have more than we can answer in that last Q&A section, I'll work with Marco to provide some written answers to some of those questions as well, as needed. And after the webinar, you'll receive a link in your follow-up email with additional forest and climate resources from WWF and the bank, including a link to the YouTube channel where you can watch a recording of the session. So thank you again for joining us. And with that, we'll get started. Marco, take us away.
Thank you very much, Emmeline. Good morning or good afternoon, everybody. So as Emmeline was already saying, my name is Marco van der Linden. I work for the World Bank, and I'm part of the team that manages the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility, or FCPF, and the BioCarbon Fund. Now, since this is a webinar in a series about REDD, I'm assuming that a lot of you are familiar with the FCPF, but you might be less familiar with the World Bank BioCarbon Fund. So I want to start with just a couple of introductory slides about what the fund is and how it has been evolving. So the World Bank BioCarbon Fund started back in 2004 with the idea to support climate smart land use and provide result-based financing. Now, back in 2004, those were mainly project scale interventions and activities. Projects, for example, as part of the Clean Development Mechanism under the UNFCCC, or projects related to afforestation, reforestation, REDD, etc., in the voluntary market. So we had several successful pilots, but the idea evolved, okay, we need to do something else, we need to do something more if we want to have a bigger impact. And next slide, please. So what was started as the sort of the next phase or the next evolving phase of the BioCarbon Fund is a new initiative, which is called the Initiative for Sustainable Forest Landscapes, or ISFL. This is a separate tranche in the fund that is trying to do two things. One is to scale up from the project scale to jurisdictional level transformations, and then hopefully ultimately to the national level. The other thing, next slide please, is that where REDD Plus and the FCPF are mainly focused on forests, the BioCarbon Fund is trying to zoom out a little bit, next slide, by going from the forest and looking at the whole landscape. So we're not just looking at forest-related emissions, but we're also looking at agriculture, energy, and livestock. The reason why we're doing that is that we noticed that if you want to have large-scale transformations in a landscape, a lot of programs are doing very different things. You might be working on climate smart agriculture, working with smallholders. You might be doing trees outside the forest to agroforestry. You might be working on grazing. If we talk about REDD, the only thing that is sort of being measured and rewarded is the effect that that has on the forest. But a lot of these activities, like planting trees, increasing soil carbon in agricultural practices, has carbon and climate benefits in itself. So the idea is, can we design a fund that can help to support those type of activities? Next slide, please. So with that, the BioCarbon Fund Initiative for Sustainable Forest Landscapes was born back in 2013. The initiative consists of two distinct pots of money. One is called BioCF Plus, which provides technical assistance, capacity building, and implementation support. And the other pot of money is for result-based payments. The contributing participants to the fund, as you can see, are Germany, Norway, the UK, and the US. Next slide, please. Since this is a fund that sits in the World Bank, obviously our interest is also not just on the climate mitigation side, but also on sustainable low carbon development. So what you see is the sort of the core parts of the approach that the fund is taking. So the idea is that ultimately the programs that we're developing and supporting will lead to low carbon development in the rural sector through improved livelihoods, increased productivity, and sustainable land use. And then what you see on the outer edge are just sort of the four pillars that are supporting that. So working at scale, that's the reflection of this idea that we will be working on a jurisdictional scale or even higher. Incentivizing results, that's about result-based payments and trying to make that conversion to low carbon development. Leveraging partnerships is very much this idea that if you work in the landscape, you cannot do it alone. You have to work with different partners. And there's a special emphasis on the role of the private sector when it comes to supply chains and the sort of the interaction between forest and agriculture. And then the fourth pillar is building on experience, which recognizes that there is a history both within the BioCarbon Fund, but also looking at, for example, what's happening in REDD, and those are things that we can learn from. Next slide, please. So just going back to that pot of money, which is result-based payments. So as we said before, we're trying to do jurisdictional programs, large-scale landscapes, and we're trying to look beyond the forest, looking at potential for emission reductions in not just the forest, but also agriculture, livestock, energy, etc. And that raises one important question. Next slide, please. And that is, what is the basis for making those result-based payments? Because this is something that hasn't really been done before. What we've seen before was that, there was, for example, in the voluntary market, obviously you could do a REDD project, or you could do a reforestation project, or you could do an agriculture project, but all of those were sort of isolated from each other. And now the new thing that the BioCF is trying to pilot is, okay, how does that work in the landscape? How do we determine what the net benefits, climate benefits are within the landscape? And then how can we provide result-based payments to support those type of actions? And next slide, please. So in order to think through that process, the fund has come up with what we call the ISFL ER program requirements. And that's basically a set of high-level requirements that the programs in the fund are expected to meet in order to be eligible to receive result-based finance. So it's sort of an expectation of, okay, this is what you need to do to have credible emission reductions from a landscape. Now, obviously, this is a fund within the World Bank with a limited number of countries. So it's really meant as a pilot. It's really meant to test out some of these approaches, see if these requirements are the right type of requirements, and So it's not meant to set any requirements on, for example, the UNFCCC, but what we do hope is that from the lessons that we learn through these programs, it will inform countries when they think about their NDCs, which in many cases are multi-sectoral, have a forestry component, have an agricultural component, and as countries think about ways of financing these type of transformations in the rural sector. Now, the ISFL requirements consist of different subsets. Since the fund is managed by the World Bank, obviously any program needs to meet World Bank Group requirements. Then there's a set of requirements that have to do with program design. And for those of you that have worked or are working on REDD, a lot of them will be familiar. It's things like a grievance and redress mechanism, benefit sharing, non-carbon benefits, etc. The third subset is the greenhouse gas reporting and accounting requirements, and that's where we will be putting most of the emphasis during this webinar. So how do you report and account for emission reductions in the landscape, and how is the ISFL trying to pilot that? And then the fourth set of requirements has to do with the documentation, the assessment process, and everything that is related to that. Next slide, please. So how have we developed these requirements? We actively worked with different groups. The ISFL contributors, so those were the 4 countries that you saw on the previous slide, and the targeted program countries. At the moment, we're targeting 5 programs in 5 different countries, and they've been part of these discussions. Together with some international greenhouse gas reporting and accounting experts, and experts that have worked on REDD+, mainly coming from the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility. So those were brought together in a series of workshops, which led to different drafts of the requirement, which were then shared broader with CSOs, academia, indigenous peoples, through a series of webinars and a public commenting period. Next slide, please. So, as I said, during this webinar, we're mainly going to focus on the reporting and the accounting requirements, because that's probably where most of the innovation sits. Also, as I said before, the requirements are relatively high level, so don't expect a very detailed protocol or methodologies with hundreds of equations. It's a set of relatively, it sort of sets a framework. Within that framework, there's then room for a country or program to find its own solutions. But what the requirements do is that they make a distinction between what we call ISFL reporting and accounting. Next slide, please. So to start with the reporting, so the reporting, this is language that, for those of you that have been working on, for example, IPCC inventories and the IPCC guidelines, that's a distinction that you might be familiar with. So the reporting is just the collection of greenhouse gas data and reporting what the emissions are. So there's an expectation in the requirements that programs report on all fully related emissions and removals from program area. So again, the program area is supposed to be a jurisdiction, like a province, a state, maybe an ecoregion in the country. And the country should collect then all the existing greenhouse gas data for that particular area. The expectation is not that you would do new measurements or collect new data, but rather you use the existing data from the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory or similar processes like the REDD+ process that a lot of countries are going through. And the reporting is then used to support program design and thinking through, okay, what in this landscape are my most significant sources of emissions? Next slide, please. So that works out in 3 sort of big buckets. Next slide. The first thing is that based on this sort of program level greenhouse gas inventory, using best available data. You look at, okay, what's the contribution of key sources and things in my landscape? Where are the main emissions in this landscape coming from? Is that deforestation? Is it agriculture-related emissions? Is it livestock-related emissions? And the idea is that, okay, if I design a program to reduce my emissions in the landscape, that you obviously start to focus on the ones that are most significant, that have the biggest contribution to your overall emission profile. Next slide, please. And the second thing that this inventory is used for is to look at the trends. And again, for those of you that are familiar with the IPCC processes, this is something that really comes from this idea of a key category analysis. So the idea is that either quantitative or qualitative, you look at key drivers. So what is underlying these main sources of emissions in my landscape, and is that changing? You might conclude, okay, at the moment, agriculture is the biggest source of emissions, but we really see that deforestation is increasing. So we're expecting that in the future, that might become the biggest source of emissions. Or you might have said, okay, something was a big source of emissions in the past, but because of reason X and Y, we expect that source to decrease, or the significance of that source to decrease. So that's the second way that we use the greenhouse gas inventory data. Next slide, please. And then the third part of the program design is the risk of displacement. So displacement is this idea that if you work on the scale of a state or a province, and you're trying to reduce the emissions in that province, that you should not be doing that by just moving the emission-intensive activities to another part of the country. But that you should really try to address the fundamentals of it. So when you're looking at the greenhouse gas inventory and you started to think to a program design, the idea is also, okay, is there a risk of displacement of these emissions by the type of activities that I'm planning? Next slide, please. So that was the ISFL reporting. So again, it's an exercise using best available data to come up with an emissions profile for the landscape, which should inform then the program design. So we are sure that we're doing something that has, the best impact. Then the second part of the requirement deals with the accounting. So where the reporting is merely doing the inventory and reporting on emissions, the accounting part is where we start comparing those emissions with a baseline, and we start counting and calculating emission reductions. And that's where we then get to the question, okay, if we determine emission reductions in a landscape, what are the sort of quality requirements that might be required to give confidence to, on one hand, the donors who are paying for the emission reductions, but also to the bigger world that those emission reductions are real, that they are sustainable emission reductions, that they're long-term emission reductions. So that's the process of the ISFL accounting, which includes determining, what is eligible for receiving result-based payments. Next slide, please. So there's different steps in this accounting process, and in the next couple of slides, I'm gonna walk you through those steps one by one. So as I said, the basis for all of this is the reporting and this sort of greenhouse gas inventory that you do in the program scale. So that would have a wide overview of all the sources of emissions and potential removals in a landscape, organized in the way that the IPCC greenhouse gas inventory guidelines organize sort of land-based accounting. So you would look at your conversions, your main categories, the subcategories, forest converting to grassland, grassland converting back to forest, enteric fermentation from livestock, divided up over different categories like cattle or chickens, or there's many ways that you can organize your greenhouse gas inventory. But basically, you start with that, and you start with this whole list of the emissions in the landscape and how much that contribution is. Then the second step is that out of that long list, or potentially long list of emission sources, the program will do an initial selection of the required and voluntary subcategories. Again, for those of you that are familiar with the IPCC, it sort of follows this idea of a key category analysis. Next slide, please. But when it comes to that initial selection, there are some, let's say, political choices that have been made. The initiative is, as the name said, is meant to mainly address sustainable forest landscapes. So you could look at the inventory and you could just say, okay, what are my most significant sources of emissions? But since the fund has other requirements and other expectations as well, there's a number of categories that will need to be selected by the program. The first one is conversions from and to forest land. That's how you would, in IPCC language, classify it. For those of you that are more familiar with the sort of REDD+ language, conversions from forest to something else is basically deforestation. Conversions to forest land is afforestation, reforestation. The second category is forest lands remaining forest lands, which in sort of REDD speak would be your forest degradation and your enhancement of forest carbon stocks. The third compulsory or mandatory category is conversions between land use categories other than forest. So that will be conversions from, for example, grassland to cropland, or the other way around. But generally things that you should be able to see from remote sensing images. And then the fourth one is the single most significant of the remaining subcategories. So that's whatever is biggest in the landscape after you've dealt with the forest categories. And then countries and programs might also select additional subcategories on a voluntary basis. So on the left-hand side, you can see a little example of that. So we have Country X, they have a program, they've done their greenhouse gas inventory, and then based on this sort of initial selection, they've come up with these 6 categories that you see on the screen. So because conversions from and to forest are mandatory, they included forest to croplands and forest to grasslands. Then forest remaining forest is mandatory, so that's included as well. Other conversions like grasslands to croplands. Then the single most significant other source, in this case, in this example, is enteric fermentation. So the size of the source is sort of indicated by the length of the green bar. And then let's say that on a voluntary basis, if they want to do wetland, something with wetlands, maybe because there's important peatlands. Next slide, please. So, and again, the process, we start with the inventory, which covers all the categories and all the sources and emissions in the landscape. Then we do this initial selection based on these sort of political requirements, but also based on the significance of the emissions. Then the next step is to see if the categories that we selected, are they meeting the quality requirements to be eligible for result-based payments? Next slide, please. And the way we've sort of envisioned that is it sort of works like a funnel. So you have that list that we saw on the previous slides, and we compare that list against two sets of requirements. The first set of requirements, it has to do with data quality. So there's an expectation that data at a minimum would be IPCC Tier 2, and for any land use related activities, that it would follow IPCC approach 3. So for those of you that are not that familiar with the IPCC guidelines, approach 3 requires that you are able to track conversions between land use categories spatially, so you know where the conversions occur. So that's the first check. Okay, I have these categories. I would like to include those in my program. If I look at the quality of the data that I have for these categories, are they sufficient to meet these quality requirements? Now the second check on the next slide, please, has to do with baseline requirements. There's an expectation that the baseline is going to be based on an average annual historic emissions and removals. So that's something that people working in REDD are very familiar with. And this idea is sort of extended or copied when it comes to other sources of emissions or removals in the landscape. But most of you would be familiar with this. If you want to do historic emissions and removals or changes for a forest, we know that we can go back and look at historic remote sensing images. But now imagine that you want to do, for example, something related to livestock, and you have to start building a baseline that is also based on historic data. Now then the question is, okay, how do I collect that data? Because I can look at a remote sensing image from 2005, but that will not give me any information about, for example, the amount of cows in a landscape. So it means you need to go back and you need to find out, okay, do I have historic data that are required to calculate my historic emissions from a particular source? And how far does that go back? And do those data then also meet the quality requirements that we saw on the previous slide? So, do they meet IPCC Tier 2, etc.? Next slide, please. So you've done that. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So once you've done that, you might come to the conclusion that not all of the categories that you had in your initial selection meet those quality requirements. Next slide, please. So to go back to the example that we've been using, so this is the same list of 6 categories that we had coming out of the process. So again, we started with the complete greenhouse gas inventory for the program, maybe just 20-25 sources. Then based on these initial selection criteria, we came up with a subset, which is these 6. We checked those against the quality requirements, and the conclusion is that 4 out of 6 meet the quality requirements. So those are the 4 that have a little tick mark associated with it. The next slide, please. So for those 4, those then meet the requirements and are therefore eligible to receive result-based payments, assuming that you manage to create emission reductions. So then the next step for those 4 categories is that we need to determine an emissions baseline for the program, and that emissions baseline is made up out of these 4 categories. So it's going to be the net historic emissions over these 4 categories, expressed as tons of CO2 per year. Next slide, please. But then we have these two categories where we've had concluded before, okay, these are important, those are significant sources of emissions in the landscape. Ideally we should include them in our program, but now we've reached a situation where they don't meet the quality requirements. We don't have good enough data, or we don't have an historic data set. So what should we do? The idea is that you can still include those categories at some stage, but not from the start of the program. The idea is that you would first start to collect data in order to improve basically what it means. So maybe your conclusion was, okay, I have historic data, but they don't meet IPCC tier 2 because my emission factor is not good enough. That could mean that you could work up a plan to improve your emission factor. Another option is that you say, okay, I have in principle good quality data, but I don't have a very long historic time series. Then the idea is that you could start the program with a limited set of categories and use the first couple of years, the first phase of the program, to collect more data, slowly building up a longer historic time series until you meet the requirements that are set by the program, by the fund. Next slide, please. So that leads to this slide. So there's really this recognition in the fund that countries in most cases will not have sufficient data of sufficient quality to meet all these requirements from the start. If you look at the landscape, if you look at what countries have been doing with their national greenhouse gas inventories, in a lot of cases, there's IPCC tier 1. You might not have such a long historic time series. So the idea is that as part of the program and through the support of the funds, countries start working on improving that. And therefore, the fund introduced this idea of phasing. So the fund is going to run until 2030. So that means that between now and then, we have 10, 12 years for the program to run, to be able to receive result-based payments. Before they sign a contract for result-based payments, what we call an ERPA, an Emission Reduction Payment Agreement, they do the steps that we just worked through. They do the inventory, they do the analysis, they develop a baseline, and then they work on a plan to increase the completeness of the accounting scope going forward, trying to cover those categories that were found to be lacking, either in quality or in historic time series. Then you start the first phase with a more limited set of categories. You improve your data, you collect more data. At the end of that phase, you repeat the inventory. You see if are these still the most significant sources of emissions, or has something changed. You update the baseline, and then you bring in new categories. Next slide, please. So just as an example of how this might look like, so let's assume that country has done their analysis, they've done their inventory, and then the conclusion is, okay, in the first phase, which might be 3 years, 5 years, we will include deforestation, and we will include some other changes in the landscape. And we have recognized that enteric fermentation from livestock is an important category, and agriculture is an important category, but right now we just don't have good enough data to meet the quality requirement, but we will start working on it. So the program starts with the deforestation only and the conversions in the landscape for phase 1. And then phase 2, maybe there's better data for the enteric fermentation. So that is then included in the program as another category for which you're able to receive result-based financing. And then in a third potential phase, agriculture is included as well. So that's really the idea that that there's phasing in of categories, that as a program you work on improving your completeness and the quality of the data that you have. And as that improves, you are eligible for more and more result-based finance. And the idea is that by doing this, countries are piloting this not just for the benefit of the ISFL, but again, it helps countries to think through some of the things they set in their NDC, which are often based around reducing emissions in all of these categories: agriculture, forests, livestock. And as the country learns from the program and improves their data, they can also show to the world, okay, we now have better data. We're not just doing this for the program, but we're also doing it as part of the NDC. And the idea is that that would hopefully also unlock additional sources of finance for the country, including if it will be negotiated under the Paris Rulebook, any result-based or market-based solutions when it comes to landscapes. Next slide, please. So just in summary, just quickly comparing the FCPF and the FCPF Carbon Fund with this new initiative for sustainable forest landscapes under the BioCF. So the FCPF and the Carbon Fund will operate to 2025, while the BioCarbon Fund will operate to 2030. FCPF has a competitive process for country selection. In the ISFL, countries are selected through a targeted process. And at the moment, the 5 targeted countries are Colombia, Zambia, Ethiopia, Indonesia, and Mexico. The FCPF purchases emission reductions for REDD+ exclusively, while the BioCarbon Fund ISFL will do result-based payments for not just REDD+, but other land use related interventions, so the whole full loop. Under the FCPF, there's a set of requirements which are called the Carbon Fund Methodological Framework. And under the BioCF ISFL, there's this other set that we just looked at, which is called the ISFL ER program requirements. And in the FCPF, since there's shorter periods, the choice of the REDD activities, the baselines is fixed. While in the BioCarbon Fund, there's a phased approach where new activities, new categories are being added as we go along, leading also to updates of the baseline. So next slide, please. Okay, go. Yeah, thank you. So that was a very quick overview of the requirements. Obviously, there's a lot more and there's a lot more details. If you go to the website that's on this screen, which is the www.biocarbonfund-isfl.org, you can find more information about the fund itself. You can find the requirements, and you can also find information about the process of developing the requirements. As I said in the beginning, the BioCarbon Fund sits in the World Bank, and it's managed by the same unit that manages the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility. If you would like to have more information about World Bank and what we are doing on climate change, there's the link on the screen. So that sort of ends my part of the presentation, and I'm sure there's plenty of questions, so I'll hand it back to Emmeline to manage that.
Thank you. Very informative. We do have some questions already, and participants, this is your time to send those questions in now. The first question I want to ask you is about scale. Are there guidelines for appropriate scale for these projects in terms of eligibility? So this person is also they have a smaller project and is wondering if there are discussions of aggregating projects in order to be able to participate.
So there's definitely an expectation of of scale, of ambition. And the expectation is it's either a jurisdictional program or it's an eco-region. I think generally what we see in the programs that have been selected, most cases it's sort of province or state, something that's one level down from the national level. Now, obviously, within that scale, and that was also one of the pillars of the ISFL, we hope that there will be cooperation between a lot of stakeholders. This is not something that a government or one entity can do. We're really talking about transformational change on a very large scale, millions of hectares. So if somebody is involved in an activity in one of the jurisdictions that have been selected, we very much would encourage you to reach out to us or to the government of the country and see how you can link up with the program and how you can contribute, and also how you can then potentially receive the benefits from the program.
Thank you. This is obviously a very comprehensive greenhouse gas accounting framework, but you mentioned that there are ways to include non-carbon benefits, the social aspects. Can you talk a little bit more about how those non-carbon benefits are included in this whole process?
There is if you look at the requirements, I haven't really gone into detail of the program design expectations, but in the selection of the programs, the donors are looking for programs and activities that have significant non-carbon benefits. Now, it is a climate finance program, so that doesn't necessarily mean that there would. So let me rephrase that. So that means that the payments will be made for the climate benefits. But when it comes to the monitoring and evaluation of the program, there is an expectation that the program will generate non-carbon benefits, and it's part of the discussion in the selection process. The requirements are not very specific on what those non-carbon benefits should be, but there is clearly an expectation that there will be non-carbon benefits.
Fantastic. And as these countries and jurisdictions develop this time-bound plan to add additional accounting categories and improving their data quality, is there additional funding provided or made available through the BioCarbon Fund Plus? And also, is there a requirement for these countries to add, is it required that they add additional subcategories, or is that simply an option for countries who are able to do so?
Yes, the idea is that the plus money, which is there for technical support, will also help with improving the data collection. Having said that, the pot of money is obviously not endless. Although the fund can contribute, I think in most cases there will also be an expectation that countries themselves contribute, or together we would find other sources of financing. On the adding of the categories, it's definitely the expectation from the donors that the country would increase the comprehensiveness and the completeness of the inventory and add additional categories. So when a contract is signed, that action plan is part of the contract, and there will be an expectation that is being implemented. If during the course of the program it turns out that is not feasible, the contract will then have options of dealing with that, depending on what the main cause for that is. But definitely it should not be considered as optional. It should be considered as part of the contract that you have with the fund.
All right. Can you share with us how the price of a mitigated ton of CO2 equivalent will be determined within this framework?
Yeah, so in principle, it's the outcome of a negotiation between the program and the fund. But the expectations from the fund side and the financial contributors is that the pricing is going to be very similar to what we currently see in the bilateral and unilateral REDD programs, where $5 or around $5 seems to be the magic number. So as I said, in principle, it can be negotiated, but the expectations are that it's going to be similar to what we see currently.
All right, and can you, is there flexibility in terms of who receives these payments? Do they go exclusively to government entities, whether they're national or subnational, or are other parties also eligible to receive benefits, these payments?
Similar to REDD+, the idea is that there will be a benefit sharing arrangement, with the idea that the money, in the end, what we hope is the shared vision between the funds and the program is that this contributes to a transformation to low carbon development in this jurisdiction, in this province, in this state. So the expectation is that the money is being reinvested to support that. And then it's depending on the country and the program context on what the best use for that money is. So normally under benefit sharing arrangements and benefit sharing plans, there's an expectation that the money not just sits with the government, but that it would go back to the actors that are operating in the landscape, generating the emission reductions. So that can be communities, that can be private sector, but there's an expectation that as part of the program design, there's a discussion in the landscape in, okay, if we receive result-based payments, what's the best way of reinvesting that? Obviously, from the fund's perspective, we can set some general requirements, but how specifically that works out, what the most effective use of the money is in a particular landscape, it's very specific to the program. But yeah, so a long answer to say that it shouldn't just be going to the government, it should be used in a way that is most effective in that landscape. Having said that, in most cases, the contract will be between the fund and one counterpart, and that counterpart is usually a government counterpart. And then the government would redistribute the money in accordance with the benefit sharing arrangements.
Fantastic. I've gotten several questions now about the role of the private sector in these processes. So is there an explicit role for them, especially big multinational companies or supply chain companies, that sort of thing, for them in the ISFL? Or are they involved mainly as partners on the ground in terms of implementation of these, emission reduction activities?
So private sector partnerships in general is one of the key pillars of the funds, and the reason for that is that if you think about what needs to be done in these landscapes, it cannot just be done by donor money, or it cannot just be done by government investments. We will need private sector, NGOs. We will need a very diverse range of stakeholders to make this happen. So the fund is putting a lot of emphasis on private sector and the role that the private sector has in supply chains, and this idea of how can we use climate finance to basically leverage and redirect money that's already there through private sector to commodity supply chains, and move that from unsustainable practices to sustainable practices. That's something that we put a lot of emphasis on, and in each of the programs we are very much looking for private sector partners to work with, and a lot of the landscapes have been selected with that in mind as well. So for example, in Indonesia, there's an interest in working on palm oil. In the Colombia program, the program is going to be in the Orinoquia region, where there's a big increase in agricultural commodities. So in each of the programs, we're really working to try and bring that private sector in. One example that we already have is in Ethiopia, where we're working with Nespresso on coffee, and how forest coffee and the coffee supply chain can help to reduce deforestation. So again, long answer, but yes, we're very much looking at private sector as a key partner in all of these landscapes.
Fantastic. I also have a cluster of questions around, those 5 countries. So you talked about, the 5 countries and 5 landscapes as really piloting this framework. But do you have a timeline for opening it up to other countries? And if so, can you share that?
At the moment, there's no expectation to open it up. Obviously, opening it up depends on a couple of factors. One being the amount of money available in the fund, but also at the moment, since a lot of the discussion in the UNFCCC about result-based payments in relation to NDCs and etc. haven't been concluded yet. The idea is really to keep it relatively small, do the pilot, and inform that process. That doesn't mean that if things evolve, that the fund couldn't open up again. But at the moment, there's not an expectation to do that.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, we've got a few more questions here, which is great because we have a few more minutes. Participants, this might be your last opportunity to send in a question if you have one burning in your brain. But I'm usually I select these while you're talking and listen at the same time. Can you talk about, let's see, some of any additional key differences between this carbon accounting for the BioCarbon Fund ISFL and the Carbon Fund methodological framework, and why the reason behind some of those differences?
So as I said, the main reason for thinking about, okay, do we need a separate set of requirements for the ISFL compared to the to what was already existing in the FCPF carbon funds, was this idea that, okay, we want to do more than REDD+, we want to look at other categories like agriculture, like livestock, and not just look at the results on the forest, but also the emission reductions directly coming from these activities. So that was basically the reason to think about the set of requirements. But as I said in the beginning, where the fund very much tries to build on the lessons learned, for example, from the FCPF. So if you put the two sets next to each other, you will also see a lot of things that are similar. Things like, the baseline requirements, 10-year historic average data. That's something that you will see in both the ISFL and the FCPF. So where the I think where the ISFL is slightly different is if you look at multiple sectors, there is the greenhouse gas inventories. How do we build on that? So greenhouse gas inventories, which are usually based around conversions in landscape and categories and certain processes, is a slightly different way of thinking in the way that REDD has been organized, which is organized around activities, deforestation, forest degradation, etc. But since it's a relatively high level, you might not see major changes. So you see a lot of the same argument. So a baseline that's based on 10 years. You need to do MRV, obviously. It needs to be linked to the national greenhouse gas inventory. We're looking at displacement. We're looking at permanence of emission reductions. So if you read the requirements, you will see that there's certain points where slightly different choices have been made to allow for this phasing in of new categories and to recognize that if you look at non-forest categories, we have differences. But I would say that the overall expectations are very similar between the FCPF methodological framework and the ISFL ER requirements.
Fantastic. We have time for one last question. Are there mechanisms in place within the fund already to address any issues of reversals occurring after the results-based payments have been made?
Yes, so we're working on that as we speak, basically. There was a significant discussion in the fund on reversals. How do we deal with that? If you go to a landscape, you're bringing in categories like livestock emissions that were traditionally considered as permanent. How do you mix that up with forest-related emissions and removals? As we move into a system with NDCs where every country is doing regular greenhouse gas inventories to the BER, do we still need this question of permanence? But the end conclusion was we will have a mechanism to deal with reversals, and it's going to be a buffer mechanism, so very similar to what the FCPF is doing and what a lot of other standards are doing when it comes to land-related emissions. So there's going to be a buffer mechanism with a relatively simple risk assessment based on two main risk factors: the anthropogenic and the program design. And that buffer is going to work very similar to how most buffers work. If the risk is reduced, then the emission reductions can be released, and if the risk increases, then the buffering will need to be topped up. It's going to be a little bit of an experiment because if you have a program with different categories, you have agriculture, you have forest, you have livestock. How do we do a sort of a risk assessment based on all these categories? But we're going to try. Again, this is something that's going to be very much piloting. Yeah, so yes, reversals, standard buffer approach, and the details of the buffer and the risk assessments are being concluded and will be made available hopefully in the next month or so.
Fantastic. And we have just now hit the hour. So I think it's time to say goodbye. Next slide, please. But I want to thank you, Marco, for really sharing your expertise with our community. This is a very technical subject and something that a lot of people obviously are very interested in. So thank you so much for coming and sharing this really, really detailed information with us. And thank you, participants, as well, for sending in your thoughtful and engaging questions. Everyone will receive a follow-up email in about an hour with some additional resources that are specific to this webinar. And if you want to revisit it, you can, or share it with colleagues. The recording will be up on the Forest and Climate YouTube channel in about a day or so. You can also find recordings of previous slides there for additional enrichment. Next slide, please. So thank you all again for joining us, and we hope you have a wonderful day.